It's Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama, and 23-year-old Sarah Jenkins sits in the parking lot of First Baptist Church, the same church where her grandmother was baptized in 1952, where her parents were married in 1987, and where she once sang in the children's choir every single week without fail. Her hand rests on the door handle. She's been sitting here for 17 minutes. She won't go in. She drives away. Again. This is the fourth Sunday in a row. Sarah isn't alone. Across the American South, a region that for generations served as the buckle of the Bible Belt, the same scene plays out in thousands of church parking lots, living rooms, and kitchen tables. Young people raised in the church are walking away. But here's what makes this different from typical stories of religious decline. They're not walking away because they've lost faith in God. They're walking away because they can no longer reconcile the faith they were taught with the culture that claims to represent it. The numbers tell a story that Southern religious leaders don't want to hear. Between 2006 and 2021, the percentage of adults in the South who identify as religiously unaffiliated jumped from 13% to 26%, according to the Pew Research Center. In Mississippi, the most religious state in America, where 77% of adults still say religion is very important in their lives, weekly church attendance has dropped by 19% since 2008. In Tennessee, over 400 churches closed their doors permanently between 2010 and 2020, and this was before the pandemic accelerated the decline. But these statistics barely scratch the surface of what's actually happening. Because this isn't just about empty pews, this is about an identity crisis that cuts to the very core of what it means to be Southern. For nearly 2 centuries, being Southern and being Christian were essentially synonymous. The South wasn't just a place where people went to church, it was a place where the church was the center of literally everything: social life, business networks, political power, community identity, even dating. If you wanted to know who someone was in a Southern town, you didn't ask where they worked. You asked where they went to church. The answer told you everything: their social class, their political leanings, their family connections, their values. This wasn't accidental. The unique brand of Christianity that took root in the South developed its distinctive character during the antebellum period. By 1845, Southern Baptists had split from their Northern counterparts over the issue of slavery, with Southern religious leaders crafting elaborate theological justifications for the institution. After the Civil War, as the South rebuilt itself from the ashes, the church became the primary vessel for preserving Southern identity and pride in the face of defeat and Reconstruction. Historian Charles Reagan Wilson documented how religion and regional identity fused into what he called the religion of the lost cause. Churches became guardians of Southern memory and Southern distinctiveness. They taught that the South had a special covenant with God, that it represented authentic Christianity in a modernizing America, that its suffering during the war was redemptive. Generation after generation, Southern preachers wove together Christianity, cultural conservatism, racial hierarchy, and regional pride into a single unbreakable cord. By the mid-20th century, this fusion was complete. Billy Graham, born in North Carolina, became America's preacher. The Southern Baptist Convention grew into the largest Protestant denomination in the country, with over 16 million members. When Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, 8 local white clergymen had published a statement calling his civil rights activities unwise and untimely, demonstrating how thoroughly Southern churches had aligned themselves with the existing social order. For decades, this system worked. Churches grew, influence expanded. The South remained the most religious region in America. Republican politicians learned that Southern evangelicals were the most reliable voting bloc in American politics, turning out in percentages that made other demographics envious. As recently as 2004, white evangelical Protestants in the South voted Republican at a rate of 80%. But something started to crack around 2008, and it wasn't what anyone expected. I want to take a moment here because this channel only exists because of viewers like you. If you find these deep dives into the hidden corners of history valuable, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps Professor Archive reach more curious minds. And if you're feeling generous, a super thanks means we can keep producing these detailed investigations. Now, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? And what's your profession? Drop a comment. I read every single one. The crisis didn't begin with theology. It began with hypocrisy, and the internet made sure everyone could see it. In the fall of 2006, Ted Haggard, president of the National Association of Evangelicals and pastor of a 14,000-member megachurch in Colorado, was exposed for a relationship with a male prostitute and methamphetamine use. This came just weeks after he had supported a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. The Southern evangelical response was predictable: condemnation, then forgiveness, then rehabilitation. But something was different this time. Young people who had grown up in these churches, who had been taught that homosexuality was an abomination, who had been told that Christianity meant living by a strict moral code, started asking questions on newly popular social media platforms that their parents couldn't easily answer. Then came 2016, and everything accelerated. When 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump, a thrice-married casino owner who bragged about sexual assault on tape, something shattered for a generation of young Southern Christians. Youth pastors who had spent years teaching purity culture, who had made teenagers sign virginity pledges, who had preached about the sanctity of marriage and Christian character, were now arguing that character didn't matter in a leader. Madison Moore was 19 when it happened. Raised in a Southern Baptist church in Georgia, she had been homeschooled specifically to protect her from secular influences. "I remember my youth pastor telling us that we needed to be set apart from the world," she recalled in a 2021 interview with Religion News Service. "Then I watched him post on Facebook about how Trump was God's chosen vessel, and we needed to overlook his flaws. But we couldn't overlook flaws in anyone else. That's when I realized the rules only applied in one direction." The data shows Madison's experience wasn't isolated. A 2019 study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that among Americans aged 18-29 who had left the faith they were raised in, 29% cited negative teachings about or treatment of LGBTQ people as an important factor, and 23% cited clergy sexual abuse scandals and cover-ups. But among those in the South specifically, an additional factor emerged. 31% cited the embrace of Trump and political partisanship as a reason for their departure. Here's where it gets truly complicated. While young people were leaving, the churches were doubling down. Between 2016 and 2020, hundreds of Southern Baptist churches became more politically explicit in their messaging, not less. Pastors who had once maintained at least a thin veneer of political neutrality began openly campaigning from the pulpit. Christian nationalism, the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation and should be governed by Christian principles, became not a fringe position but mainstream doctrine in thousands of Southern churches. In June 2021, the Southern Baptist Convention held its annual meeting in Nashville. Reform-minded younger pastors thought they finally had the numbers to push the denomination toward reckoning with its racial history and addressing a sexual abuse scandal that had been covered up for decades. They lost, decisively. The convention elected a president who opposed critical race theory and promised to protect the convention from woke influences. Messengers at that convention voted down a resolution that would have more strongly condemned sexual abuse. They rejected measures for greater accountability in abuse cases. And they passed resolutions firmly opposing any social justice movements that challenged traditional Southern cultural values. Within a week, over 120 churches announced they were considering leaving the denomination. But more significantly, thousands of individuals simply stopped going. No announcement, no drama, just empty seats. The Southern Baptist Convention has lost over 2 million members since 2006, a decline of more than 13%. But the losses are not evenly distributed. Rural churches in the Deep South are actually holding steady or even growing slightly. It's suburban churches near universities and cities that are hemorrhaging members, the very places where young, educated Southerners are concentrated. This creates a vicious cycle. As progressive members leave, the churches become more conservative. As churches become more conservative, more progressive members leave. The remaining members interpret the declining numbers not as a sign that they need to change, but as proof that they're being persecuted for standing firm on truth. Pastor John Weed of a small town in Mississippi told Christianity Today in 2022, "We've lost about 40% of our young people, but we haven't compromised. And I won't compromise. If holding to biblical truth means we're smaller, so be it. Jesus said the path was narrow." But here's the twist that even Pastor Wheat doesn't fully recognize. Many of the young people who leave aren't abandoning the core teachings of Christianity. They're abandoning the cultural package that Southern churches have wrapped around it. Rachel Dawson, a 26-year-old from Alabama, put it this way: "I still pray every day. I still believe in Jesus. I still read my Bible. What I can't do anymore is sit in a church where the same people who taught me that Jesus said to love your neighbor and welcome the stranger spend all week posting about building a wall and keeping refugees out. It's not that I lost my faith, it's that I can't find it in those buildings anymore." This distinction is crucial. While religious affiliation is declining in the South, surveys show that personal spirituality remains high. A 2020 Barna Group study found that among religiously unaffiliated young adults in the South, 62% still pray at least occasionally, and 47% consider themselves spiritual. They haven't rejected God, they've rejected the institution. The Southern Church's response has been to frame this as a culture war they're losing, but that framing misses the deeper problem. For generations, Southern identity and Southern Christianity were so intertwined that you couldn't reject one without feeling like you were rejecting both. If you're a young person in the South who believes in racial justice, LGBTQ rights, or even just basic scientific consensus on climate change, leaving the church often means being cut off from your family, your social network, your business connections, everything. The church isn't just where you worship in the South, it's where you belong. Leaving means exile. And that's precisely why this crisis can't be fixed with the usual solutions. Church leaders keep trying strategies that worked in the past. They upgrade the sound systems, hire younger worship leaders, add coffee bars and casual dress codes. Megachurches spend millions on elaborate light shows and fog machines. But when Lifeway Research surveyed people who had left evangelical churches and asked what would bring them back, better music ranked dead last. More authentic leadership ranked first. The deeper problem is structural. Southern religious culture developed a very specific theology that served a very specific purpose: maintaining a hierarchical social order and Southern cultural distinctiveness. That theology emphasized personal salvation, biblical literalism, traditional gender roles, submission to authority, and the importance of standing firm against cultural change. These theological positions weren't chosen randomly. They were selected and emphasized specifically because they supported the South's existing power structures. The focus on personal salvation rather than systemic justice meant wealthy white Christians could be devout without addressing poverty or racism. Biblical literalism meant that any challenge to traditional interpretations could be dismissed as ungodly. Submission to authority meant challenging pastors or questioning church leadership was akin to challenging God. For as long as the South remained relatively isolated and homogeneous, this system could sustain itself. But the internet changed everything. Young Southerners were suddenly exposed to other Christians with radically different interpretations. They discovered that many positions their churches claimed were biblical truth were actually relatively recent theological inventions. They learned about redlining, mass incarceration, and environmental destruction, issues their churches never addressed because addressing them would implicate many church members. The theology that held Southern Christianity together for 150 years can't adapt to these challenges without fundamentally changing. And if it fundamentally changes, it stops being distinctively Southern. That's the crisis nobody can fix. Any solution that would actually bring young people back would require admitting that the culture and the theology were never separate, that religion was being used to justify cultural preferences, that generations of preachers had confused their regional prejudices with God's word. But admitting that would undermine the entire foundation of Southern religious identity. Consider the issue of race. The Southern Baptist Convention was founded explicitly to defend slavery. After emancipation, Southern churches provided theological cover for Jim Crow segregation. During the Civil Rights Movement, the vast majority of white Southern churches opposed integration. In 1995, the SBC issued a formal apology for its racist history, a genuine step forward. But in 2021, when some members wanted to apply that same logic to current racial inequalities, the denomination balked. Critical race theory became the new enemy, despite most members being unable to define it. The message was clear. We're sorry about the past, but don't ask us to change anything about the present. Young black Christians in the South face an even more acute version of this crisis. Historically, black churches in the South have their own rich traditions, distinct from white evangelicalism. But over the past few decades, influenced by movements like the prosperity gospel and modern worship music, many have adopted theological and cultural positions from white evangelicalism, including conservative stances on gender and sexuality. The result is that young black Southerners often find themselves caught between churches that demand they choose between their racial identity and their theological questions. Do they stay in predominantly black churches that may be theologically conservative, or join multiracial or white churches that claim to be more progressive but often fail to address racism meaningfully? Dr. Chaniqua Walker Barnes, a black woman and professor at Mercer University's McAfee School of Theology, wrote in her book, I Bring the Voices of My People, about the impossibility of this position. She documented how many young black Christians in the South simply opt out entirely, unable to find a spiritual home that honors all of who they are. The gender dynamics add another layer of complexity. Southern churches have historically emphasized complementarianism, the belief that men and women have different, complementary roles, with men serving as leaders in church and home. For generations, this was simply accepted. But in 2023, Southern women are CEOs, doctors, lawyers, and politicians. They lead in every area of society except one: their churches. In 2023, the Southern Baptist Convention formally decided that churches with women serving as pastors could be expelled from the denomination. Saddleback Church, one of the largest and most influential churches in America, was disfellowshipped specifically because it had ordained women. The message was unmistakable, like gender hierarchy isn't negotiable. For young Southern women, this creates cognitive dissonance. Religion scholar Kristen Kobies-Dumez documented in her book Jesus and John Wayne how evangelical culture has increasingly emphasized aggressive masculinity as a Christian virtue. The same churches telling women they can't lead are celebrating a particular version of muscular Christianity that often seems more concerned with dominance than with Christ's actual teachings about humility and servanthood. What makes this crisis uniquely unfixable is that both sides are too invested in their positions to compromise. But compromise is the only path forward. Church leaders can't admit they were wrong about fundamental issues without losing their authority and potentially their jobs. The average age of a Southern Baptist pastor is 54. These men have built their entire careers and identities around a specific theological framework. Admitting that framework was culturally constructed rather than divinely ordained would mean their life's work was defending human prejudice, not God's truth. Meanwhile, young people who have left can't simply come back without feeling like they're betraying everything they've learned. They've done the reading, asked the questions, and come to conclusions that don't align with what Southern churches teach. Returning would mean either lying about what they believe or facing constant conflict. The economic incentives also work against resolution. Megachurches are multi-million-dollar operations. The Southern Baptist Convention's collective budget exceeds $200 million annually. There are jobs, pensions, real estate holdings, and institutional power at stake. Organizations don't easily vote themselves out of existence, even when their original purpose has become obsolete. In smaller churches, pastors often make $40,000, $60,000 a year. Not a fortune, but enough to support a family in many Southern towns where economic opportunities are limited. Changing their message to attract young people might grow the church, or it might cause the existing members, the ones who actually tithe, to leave. Most pastors can't afford to take that risk. There's also the political dimension. The Republican Party has become deeply dependent on white evangelical voters in the South. In the 2020 election, Trump won 76% of white evangelicals nationally, and even higher percentages in southern states. Politicians have no incentive to encourage theological evolution that might reduce that loyalty. Conservative media has amplified this dynamic. Fox News, Newsmax, and similar outlets regularly frame any criticism of conservative Christianity as persecution, creating a siege mentality that makes reform appear like surrender. Young Christians who question their church's stances on social issues are told they've been corrupted by liberal universities and mainstream media, not that they might have legitimate concerns. Here's something most people don't realize. The crisis would actually be easier to solve if it were purely about theology or purely about culture. But it's about identity, and identity is much harder to change. Being Southern means something. Walk into a small town in Alabama or Georgia, and you'll immediately feel a distinct culture. The accent, the food, the pace, the manners, the unspoken social rules. This culture is beautiful in many ways. Southern hospitality is real. The emphasis on family, community, and tradition creates deep connections. But that same culture has historically been built on exclusion. You're Southern if you fit a particular mold. White, Christian, politically conservative, traditional in your views on gender and family. Step outside that mold and you're viewed with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. For young Southerners, especially those from multi-generational Southern families, leaving the church often feels like being forced to choose. Be authentically yourself or be truly Southern. You can't be both. Emma Catherine Jones grew up in South Carolina, descended from a family that had been there since the 1700s. In a 2020 essay, she wrote, "When I came out as bisexual, my grandmother told me I'd broken a chain that had lasted 10 generations. She meant the chain of Christianity, but what she really meant was the chain of Southernness. I was still geographically in the South, but I was no longer of it. That loss is indescribable. This is why churches can't simply modernize their way out of the crisis. Changing positions on LGBTQ issues, racial justice, or women's leadership isn't like updating the hymnal or adding a contemporary service. It's changing the fundamental cultural identity that the church exists to preserve. Some churches are trying a middle path. They remain theologically conservative but try to be more welcoming in tone. They avoid talking about controversial issues from the pulpit. They emphasize service and community over politics. But this approach is also failing, just more slowly. Why? Because silence is itself a statement. When churches refuse to address racism clearly and forcefully, Black members and allies notice. When churches stay silent on LGBTQ issues, queer people and their loved ones hear that silence as rejection. When churches don't speak up about poverty, environmental destruction, or other justice issues, young people who care about these things conclude the church doesn't care. The churches that are actually growing in the South today fall into two categories. First, very conservative churches that lean fully into traditional positions and attract people who want clear certainty in an uncertain world. Second, innovative churches that have completely reimagined what church can be. House churches, online communities, social justice-oriented congregations that barely resemble traditional Southern Christianity. The traditional mainstream churches, the ones trying to bridge these worlds, are dying fastest of all. By 2040, demographic projections suggest that the South will be majority-minority, with white residents no longer forming a majority of the population. The fastest-growing religious groups in the South aren't Protestant denominations, but Catholics, driven by Latino immigration, and Muslims, driven by immigration and conversion. The percentage of religiously unaffiliated is projected to exceed 35%. This means the culturally specific, predominantly white evangelical Christianity that has defined the South for 2 centuries was always becoming, a minority tradition. The question isn't whether it will lose its dominance, but what happens as it does. Some religious leaders see this clearly and are trying to prepare their congregations for a different future. Russell Moore, formerly a top official in the Southern Baptist Convention, broke with the denomination in 2021. In a scathing letter, he described a culture of corruption, abuse cover-ups, and political idolatry. He wrote that many churches had traded the gospel for political power and cultural influence. Moore now works for Christianity Today, where he's trying to articulate a version of conservative Christianity that can survive what he calls the end of white Christian America. But he faces fierce backlash from the very people and institutions he once led. The truth is, there may not be a solution to this crisis, at least not one that preserves Southern Christianity as it's currently constituted. The same features that made it powerful and enduring are now causing its decline. Its insularity protected it from outside influences, but also prevented it from adapting to changing knowledge and values. Its emphasis on tradition and authority created stability but also rigidity. Its fusion with regional identity and culture gave it deep roots but also tied it to historical injustices that become harder to defend with each passing year. What we're witnessing isn't just the decline of church attendance or the rise of the knowns. We're witnessing the slow collapse of a 200-year-old regional religious culture that served purposes beyond worship, maintaining social order, preserving regional identity, providing community structure, and yes, justifying and perpetuating inequality. That culture is being dismantled not primarily by hostile outsiders, but by its own children, who were taught to take their faith seriously and then did exactly that. They read the Bible and found a Jesus who hung out with outcasts, challenged religious authorities, and preached radical economic redistribution. They took seriously the command to love their neighbors and asked whether that might include their gay neighbors, their Muslim neighbors, their undocumented neighbors. The tragic irony is that Southern Christianity taught them to care deeply about truth, integrity, authenticity, and moral conviction. Then, when they developed moral convictions that challenged Southern cultural norms, they were told those convictions were sinful. So they left, and they keep leaving, and the people who remain become more convinced that they're right, that they're the faithful remnant, that persecution proves their righteousness. The crisis feeds itself. Can it be fixed? Only if both sides are willing to admit they might be wrong about fundamental things. Only if church leaders are willing to say, "We were mistaken, and we're sorry, and we're going to do better." Only if young people are willing to extend grace and patience to institutions and people who hurt them. Only if everyone involved values unity and truth more than pride and cultural preservation. That seems unlikely, not because people are bad, but because the incentives all point the wrong way and the wounds go too deep. What's more likely is a slow fragmentation. Some churches will go hard right, becoming increasingly political and separatist. Others will evolve into something barely recognizable as Southern Christianity. Most will simply fade away, their buildings sold or demolished, their congregations dispersed. And through it all, people will keep seeking meaning, community, and connection with the divine. They'll just do it in ways their grandparents wouldn't recognize, in forms that don't fit neatly into the boxes that Southern culture created. The faith crisis in the South isn't about whether people can fix the churches. It's about whether the churches were ever really about faith to begin with, or whether they were always about something else. Power, culture, belonging, and the desperate human need to believe that our way of life is ordained by God. Sarah Jenkins, the young woman sitting in that parking lot in Birmingham, eventually found a spiritual community, a small group that meets in people's homes, studies the Bible together, serves at a homeless shelter, and never talks about politics. It looks nothing like the church she grew up in. Her grandmother doesn't understand it and refuses to acknowledge it as real Christianity. Sarah still drives by that parking lot sometimes. She feels the pull of nostalgia, of memory, of everything that building represented. But she doesn't stop anymore. She's found what she was looking for, just not where anyone expected her to find it. And that might be the real lesson of this crisis that nobody can fix. Sometimes things don't get fixed. Sometimes they just end. Sometimes the only way forward is to let go of what was and make space for what might be.